All right, welcome back to the deep dive. We're going to be diving into something pretty fascinating today. You know, you've been following along with us. You've been sharing some of the stuff that you found interesting. And one of the things that really stood out was OpenAI's new native image generation system, this 4o thing.
Yeah.
It's, it's not just another update to DLE or anything. They've really gone and fundamentally changed the way that they're approaching this, the underlying architecture. And they're putting a huge emphasis on safety too, which we'll get into. But we're primarily looking at their native image generation system card that they released last year.
That's right.
To really try to figure out what makes 4o tick.
Yeah.
You know, what are these new capabilities? How's the technology actually working underneath the hood? And what are some of the ways that they're trying to make sure that this thing is deployed responsibly? So our goal today, our mission for this deep dive, I guess you could say, is to really get to the heart of how 4o image generation is different and what they've done, especially from a technical perspective, but also from how they're approaching safety.
I think that's a really important point to start with. It's interesting because the biggest change right out of the gate is that they moved away from that diffusion-based approach that we saw with DLE-4o. It's operating as an autoregressive model now. And I think this is going to be particularly interesting for you as an AI student because it's natively embedded within ChatGPT now.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So the implications of how this system actually understands and generates images are pretty huge.
All right. So autoregressive models. Let's break that down a little bit more, because I think our listeners are probably familiar with the concept.
Yeah.
But to really get into how 4o is doing this compared to DLS diffusion method, how would you explain that difference to someone who is, up to speed on their AI, but maybe hasn't worked directly with these models?
Okay, well, let's think about it this way. An autoregressive model, it generates the output, which in this case is an image. Sequentially, it could be pixel by pixel, it could be token by token. And it's using what it's already generated, those previous parts, as context to figure out what's coming next.
Okay.
So picture it kind of like generating a sentence.
Okay, yeah.
Where every word is informing the next word you're going to choose.
Yeah.
Diffusion models, on the other hand, they kind of work in reverse. They usually start with just random noise and then iteratively denoise that over multiple steps until you get the final picture. Now, because 4o is building that image sequentially, it starts to develop this inherent understanding of how different elements in the picture are related as it goes along. And that can potentially lead to greater consistency within the image and a better understanding of the overall composition. Compared to a diffusion model, that's more focused on refining just those local details.
Okay.
The other piece here, and this is really crucial, is that it's embedded right within ChatGPT. This means it can actually leverage all that semantic knowledge that's in that huge language model. And that's what leads to more accurate and nuanced interpretations of the text prompts.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, so it seems like this change has unlocked some serious new capabilities. The paper talks about 3 big ones. Image-to-image transformation, which is just wild. The level of photorealism that they're achieving is also a big jump. And then way more precise instruction following. And that includes rendering text and diagrams. So how do you see this architectural change playing into those advancements?
I think it's the sequential nature of it, the way it builds, that lends itself really well to image transformations because the model already understands the structure and content of the image you're putting into it. And then it uses that as a starting point. So it can modify or create those variations based on what you tell it.
Okay.
All while keeping that coherence with the original.
So it's not just slapping on, like a new filter or something. It's really understanding what's there, building upon that.
Okay. And for photorealism, that jump probably comes from its ability to learn intricate details and the spatial relationships as it goes through that step-by-step generation. And as far as the instructions, especially with the text and diagrams, that's got to be heavily influenced by that ChatGPT integration.
Yeah.
Because the language model can now really understand those complex instructions, and then it can guide the image generation to represent that visually.
Okay, so these capabilities are super impressive.
Yeah.
But as the document points out, there are some potential risks that come with this. I mean, imagine the ability to really make changes to photographs that are hard to detect. Or what if someone could generate a schematic for a weapon? If the safeguards weren't there, it could get out of hand pretty quickly.
You're absolutely right. The more powerful the tool, the more we have to think about how it could be misused. We're talking about incredibly realistic images now. Manipulation could be used for disinformation, even for malicious purposes. And the precision of those instructions, it's a double-edged sword. Great for good uses, but potentially very dangerous if not carefully controlled. And that's precisely why OpenAI has invested so much in what they call their safety stack.
Right, that safety stack. So let's dive into that because they outline a pretty layered strategy here, starting with the chat model in ChatGPT itself, which is acting as the first line of defense. If a prompt violates their policies, the chat model won't even let you start generating an image.
Exactly. That underlying language model, it's already got all these really sophisticated safety measures built in after the training. It's designed to understand what you're actually trying to do with your prompt.
Okay.
And it can block requests that fall into those no-go categories right away. So it doesn't even get to the image generation part of the system. Think of it like a filter.
Okay.
Based on what you're actually saying in your prompt.
So it's like a bouncer at the door, kind of.
That's a great analogy. Yeah.
Okay, so let's say a prompt does sneak past that first check. There's another layer, prompt blocking, where the prompt gets examined by text and image classifiers before 4o really kicks in. So what's the reason for having this extra step?
It's about adding specialization. Even if the language model misses something, these classifiers are trained to zero in on content that could be harmful, but specifically in the context of generating images.
Oh, right.
They analyze the text for certain keywords, but they can also look at uploaded images if it's an image-to-image request. They're looking for patterns, specific elements that go against those safety guidelines. It's a way to have more fine-grained control at the moment the image is actually generated.
Got it. And so even after all that, the safety checks don't stop. They have output blocking too. And this is where those multimodal reasoning models and CSAM classifiers come in to catch anything that might have slipped through.
Exactly.
Before the user even sees it. How does that work?
That multimodal reasoning model is super interesting. It's been trained on OpenAI's content policies, so it can actually understand what the generated image means.
Right.
Not just what it looks like, but how it relates back to the original prompt. So it can spot violations that the prompt analysis might have missed. And alongside that, you've got those CSAM classifiers,
Right.
specifically looking for child sexual abuse material.
Yeah.
It's like a final safety net to make absolutely sure those prohibited images don't get out there.
That's good to hear. And then they also talk about even more safeguards for anyone under 18. And if you're under 13, you can't even use the system. They're really serious about protecting younger users.
Absolutely. They recognize that minors are more vulnerable. So those safety measures we talked about, they're cranked up even higher for anyone identified as under 18.
Okay.
And that outright ban for under 13s shows just how committed they are to protecting kids from potential harm.
Yeah, it definitely sends a strong message. So they did a lot of work to test how well this safety stack is working. They use three main methods, and I think these are worth breaking down. External, manual red teaming, which is basically bringing in experts to try and break the system. Automated red teaming, where they use their own model policies to come up with tricky scenarios. And then offline testing with real-world examples. So let's start with that external red teaming. What did they find?
External red teaming, it's like having a fresh set of eyes. People from outside OpenAI coming in with all sorts of creative ways to try and break things. So these red teamers, their whole goal is to generate content that's prohibited, using different prompts, different techniques, really trying to push the boundaries. And what they learn from that, it's invaluable because it helps them identify blind spots. And it can even inform how they develop those automated evaluations. It's about anticipating how people might try to misuse the system.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. They also tracked two key metrics during that process. Not unsafe, which basically means the system didn't generate anything bad.
Right.
And not a refuse, which is whether it blocked something that was actually okay. So the tables in the document show that their not unsafe rates are generally pretty good, especially when that full safety stack is on. What does that tell us?
It means those safety measures, especially when they're all working together, seem to be pretty good at actually stopping prohibited content from being generated, even when people are actively trying to trick the system.
Okay, so they're holding up well.
They are, for the most part, but there's this interesting thing that happens with not over refuse. When those chat model refusals are really active, that rate dips a bit. It shows you the challenge in designing these systems. You want to stop the bad stuff, but you also don't want to accidentally block things that are fine.
Right, finding that balance is tricky.
It is. It's a constant back and forth, but the results from Table 1 are pretty encouraging.
Okay, so what were those numbers?
With the full safety stack in place, their not-con-safe rate was over 97%.
Wow, okay.
That's a pretty strong indication that the system is working.
Yeah. That's pretty impressive.
Okay.
Okay, so automated red teaming. They use their own model policies to make all sorts of test scenarios. How is that different, and why is that useful?
It's more systematic. Instead of relying on people to think up tricky scenarios, they use their understanding of the policies to generate a ton of test cases automatically.
Okay.
It covers so many more potential violations and weird edge cases with or without images in the prompts. So it's comprehensive and they can repeat it over and over again. And when we look at Table 2, the performance is comparable to that manual red teaming.
Okay.
So it really reinforces the idea that those safety measures are working even across a much broader set of scenarios.
So it's not just, a couple of humans coming up with things. They're really testing it across a huge range.
Exactly.
Okay. And then finally, they did that offline testing with real-world scenarios. Why is that important? I mean, we've already done all this red teaming.
Real-world testing is all about making sure that what worked in those controlled environments actually holds up in real life. Because users, they're unpredictable. They'll come up with all sorts of things that you might not have thought of in a lab setting. So they took those real-world examples, those use cases, across all of those different safety categories. And what they found in Table 3 was really promising. It's minimizing unsafe outputs, but it's also got a really high not-over-refuse rate.
Okay.
Which means it's working well with the kind of prompts that people are actually going to use it for.
Okay, so it seems like they've done their homework in terms of making sure the system is actually safe to use in practice.
Yeah, they've really tried to cover their bases.
So let's get into some specific areas where things could get especially tricky. The document spends a lot of time on child safety, and it's clear that this is a top priority for them. They've got a multi-layered approach, everything from prevention to detection to reporting. What are some of the highlights there?
Child safety, it's a no-brainer. It has to be at the top of the list. And you can see that in their approach. No editing of uploaded photorealistic images of children, at least not at launch. That's a big one.
Yeah.
And they've reinforced all those CSAM protections. But I think the detection mechanisms they're using, those are really interesting, especially from an AI perspective.
Right. So they're using Thorn's Safer System to catch known CSAM in uploads. And then they have their own multimodal moderation classifier for generated content that might be sexual and involve minors. But then there's the photorealistic person classifier.
Right. This one's based on SORA's under 18 classifier.
Right.
And it's all about analyzing those uploaded images.
Okay.
So it's looking to see if there's a photorealistic person in the image, and then it tries to figure out if they're an adult or a child. And here's the key thing. If it's not sure, if it thinks the image might contain both an adult and a child, it automatically classifies it as containing a child.
Oh, that's smart.
Yeah, it's about playing it safe. Better to be overly cautious in a situation like that.
Definitely.
Now, they did look at how well this classifier performs, and the results are in Table 4. It's really good at picking out photorealistic adults and children, but they admit that sometimes it can be hard to accurately classify someone who looks younger than they are.
Yeah, I can see how that could be an issue. So they're aware of those limitations, at least.
They are, and they're working to improve it.
Okay, that's good. Another area they focused on is artist styles. There's been a lot of discussion in the creative community about AI copying the styles of living artists, and it seems like they're being careful about that.
This is a tricky one.
It is.
But I think their approach makes sense. If you try to generate something in the style of a living artist, the system is designed to refuse.
Oh, wow.
It's a clear line, and it shows that they're aware of those intellectual property concerns. They're trying to avoid any harm or disruption to artists' careers.
So no Starry Night, but with, like, kittens instead of stars.
No, not at this point, at least. It's a conservative approach, but it shows they're taking those concerns seriously.
Yeah, that's good to see. Okay, so public figures. This is another area where things get complicated. They've actually changed their approach from Day AE, where there was a blanket ban on generating images of public figures. Now, they allow it for adults, but with those same safety measures in place.
This is a really interesting shift.
It is. So what's the thinking there?
Well, they seem to be acknowledging that there are legitimate, even helpful uses for generating images of public figures. Think educational contexts, satire, maybe even some news illustrations.
Okay.
But they're not just throwing the doors wide open. They're still applying those restrictions.
Right.
No photorealistic minors, no violent or hateful content, and no depictions of public figures engaged in illegal activities. And public figures can opt out if they don't want their likeness used at all. So there's an element of control there.
Okay, that makes sense. So it's a more nuanced approach, but with those guardrails still in place.
Exactly.
Bias is another big concern with any generative AI system.
Yeah.
The document says that 4o is better than DLLE3 in this area, but they're still working on it, especially when it comes to demographic representation. So how are they going about identifying and dealing with those biases?
Their focus is on representational biases, how different demographic attributes like gender, race, and skin tone are showing up in the images.
Okay.
And their method is pretty clever. They use what they call under-specified prompts. So things like a happy person, a doctor, 3 construction workers, prompts where you're not explicitly saying what gender, race, or skin tone you want. And then they look at how those attributes are distributed in the generated images. And they do this across multiple runs to get a good sense of the patterns.
Got it. So what are they measuring?
They've got a few key metrics. First, there's just straight up class distributions.
Yep.
So how often are we seeing male versus female, different racial groups, different skin tones? Then there's the frequency of heterogeneous outputs, which is basically how often does a prompt generate images with a mix of those attributes across different generations.
Okay.
A higher frequency there is good. It means the model's creating more diverse representations.
Got it.
And then there's skew, which is measured by something called Shannon entropy. It's basically a way to look at how uniform or how imbalanced the outputs are.
Okay, so a score closer to 1 means it's more balanced?
Exactly. So if we look at their gender evaluations, which are in tables 5 and 6, it's better than DLAE3, but there's still a bias towards male subjects. They're trying to increase that heterogeneity and entropy to get a more even distribution of genders.
Makes sense.
Same idea with race. In tables 7 and 8, 4o is doing better than its predecessor, generating a wider variety of people, but white individuals are still showing up more often. And skin tone, that's in tables 9 and 10. Both models tend to lean towards lighter skin tones, but they say most prompts do result in a variety of skin tones.
Okay, so it sounds like they're being very thorough in how they're measuring this.
They are. They're really digging into the data to see where those biases exist, and that gives them a starting point for how to address them.
And then they also looked at something called ahistorical and unrealistic bias, which sounds pretty complex. What is that about?
It's about making sure that the model doesn't generate images that are historically inaccurate or unrealistic when it comes to demographics.
Okay.
So if you give it a prompt that should result in a specific demographic representation, does it do that? Or does it introduce variations that don't make sense in that context? They say 4o scored really well on this, which is good news. It means it's less likely to generate images with inappropriate demographic variations, especially when those variations aren't specifically requested in the prompt.
Okay, so it's not just about being unbiased in general. It's about being accurate and appropriate within specific context.
Precise.
Okay, so on top of all this, they also looked at some other sensitive areas. Erotic content, images that are violent or hateful, and instructions for illegal activities. And it looks like they've got specific policies and ways to deal with each of those, which they lay out in tables 12, 13, and 14. And the not safe rates are pretty high across the board.
Yeah, they've got clear content policies for those high-risk areas.
Okay.
And they've done the evaluations to make sure that the system is good at blocking that kind of content. But it's also important to note that they're trying to be nuanced, especially with things like violence or hate. They do want to allow for artistic expression or educational uses, but anything that's actually harmful or abusive, especially when it comes to minors, is strictly off limits.
Okay, so it's not just black and white. They're trying to be thoughtful about how they apply those rules.
Exactly.
Okay, last but not least, they talk about provenance. This is all about knowing where a generated image came from and being able to verify its authenticity.
Right.
So what are they doing in this area?
They're using C2PA metadata on everything that 4o generates. So this is a big deal for anyone studying AI because C2PA is an industry standard that embeds all this verifiable information about the origin and history of a digital asset right into the file itself.
Okay.
And they also have their own internal tools to double check whether an image was made using their products. But they're clear that provenance isn't just their responsibility, it's something the whole industry needs to work on.
It's like a digital fingerprint, in a way.
Exactly.
Okay, so big picture, what have we learned from this deep dive into 4o?
I think it's safe to say that 4o represents a huge step forward in image generation. That move to an autoregressive architecture, it's a game changer. But, and this is so important, that increased capability has come with a lot of attention to safety. They've built in all these safeguards, and they're constantly evaluating and refining them. It's a very holistic approach.
Yeah, and they're very transparent about it, which is great.
Absolutely. The detail they provide in their evaluation metrics, how they've tested it against all those different risks, it's a really valuable case study in how to do AI development responsibly.
Right. And they're very upfront about the fact that there's still work to do, especially when it comes to things like bias and content moderation. It's a constant evolution.
It is, and honestly, it should be. The goal is to make AI image generation safer and more unbiased, and that's an ongoing process. There's always room for improvement.
All right, so for all those AI students out there listening, we'll leave you with this. This move to a natively integrated, autoregressive, multimodal model like 4o. How do you think this is going to change things? What are the implications for generative AI, not just for images, but across all sorts of modalities?
That's the question, isn't it?
Yeah. And with this tighter integration, how is human-computer interaction going to evolve?
It's exciting to think about.
It is. What new research questions are going to come out of this? Both in terms of pushing those creative boundaries, but also in terms of making sure it's all done responsibly. It's a lot to ponder. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. We'll catch you next time.